Welcome to the Protagonist Pub. My name is Tammy, and this is where characters gather. So, today is an intro video for a series I'm starting. And it has come about because of what I'm going to refer to as the great content debate in reading. What our kids are reading, what we're reading as adults, what is becoming mainstream, and how there is no objective, agreed upon definition of what is or isn't content that can easily be determined. Like, for example, physical touching in a romance book. How much is too much? What defines where that scale begins? For some of us, if the protagonist kiss, it borders on too much, or it is too much. For others, like myself, it would be incredibly weird if in a romance book the characters didn't kiss. And that's just one example. So I have my handy dandy planner, and in said handy dandy planner, hello Kahlua, I wrote out a bunch of bullet points to discuss. So we're going to talk about the bullet points, and I have a list of 10 authors I am personally comfortable recommending. I would recommend them to anyone. I would, be comfortable with my teenager reading said recommendations, and I will explain why as I talk about my bullet points this morning. But we throw a lot of labels around. We throw a lot of, trigger words around, which, as you all know, I don't understand the need for. But they have no meaning. They seriously, they have no objective meaning. How much spice is too much spice? What is your spicy scale? And does your spicy scale match up with, let's say, your next door neighbor's spicy scale? The answer is no. There's no objective meaning to any of it. So I don't normally write stuff out for videos unless it's like, prompts for a tag and I need to know what the prompts are. But in general, I don't write stuff out for videos. But this was important enough to me that I wrote stuff out. So my first bullet point is, what constitutes a clean read for me? And even the use of the word clean is controversial because it implies that anything that isn't clean for me is somehow dirty for someone else. Anybody can get offended by anything these days, and I refuse to tiptoe around the issue. If you somehow think that what is clean for me is dirty for you, or, what I consider clean is overly dirty for you, I'm sorry, but I cannot sugarcoat stuff to make people's feelings better. It's not within my nature. So, for me, what constitutes a clean read? In general, I think a clean read is, in essence, if you took out the objectionable stuff, be it swearing, open door scenes, kissing, any of that stuff that comes up as objectionable, would the book stand on its own 2 feet? If you remove the objectionable, do you still have a story? Do you still have a book that has a beginning, a middle, and an end? It has protagonist, it has an antagonist, there's a plot. Can it stand on its own? And if it can't stand on its own without the objective, criteria for you that's objectionable, then it's obviously not a book you're going to read. Does that mean that same book in the hands of another reader is going to fail? No. Does it make that book unworthy of being written? No. But it's a sliding scale. So for me, a clean read is if there is content in something I have picked up, does the book on its own stand up? Or is it so dependent on the objectionable content that it just falls apart without it? So I'll give you a couple examples. As you all know, I recently read Fourth Wing and the Rebecca Yarros Horny Dragon series. And I've read both books released. There is a level of open door in those books that I am not comfortable with. And there is more swearing. There's not a lot of swearing in those books, but there is swearing in those books. And, could the book have stood without it? Yes. So, in that series, for example, the open door scenes are nowhere near as spicy as they could have been, and they were pretty spicy in my opinion. But B, they were appropriate for the storyline. They were absolutely not gratuitous, and without them, the book would have fallen flat. Now, did I skip reading the spicy scenes? Yes. Do I think they needed to be in there? I think they did. I'm not gonna lie, I really think they did. So there's one example. Another example is I'm not calling this author out, but I'm going to use her as an example. And that is Stay With Me by Becky Wade. That book was incredibly heavy and incredibly preachy in its faith. And I did read the book. I did enjoy the book. However, I think if you took the faith out of that story, the book would have had trouble standing on its own 2 feet. And that is a weak plot structure for me. And I have enjoyed we all know I have a problem with Christian fiction authors who do not make it publicly known what their faith is. I don't know if they're, trying to keep it on the down low because it's controversial, or if they're, actually Christian, I, I don't know. I don't understand why it's hidden. I don't understand why they don't say, I'm a Baptist, I'm, an Anglican, or I'm a Pentecostal. I need some basis to understand where the author is coming from in their fiction. And I do not understand the keeping it hidden thing. And that makes a lot of Christian fiction books, for me, fall not flat, but I'm going to be honest. I'm always leery going in because I don't know. And I don't know what I'm going to read. I am open about what my faith is. I don't hide the fact that I, am not just going to automatically assume a Christian book is a good fit for me, because it's honestly, most of the time, it is not. The story may, have the ability to stand up on its own, but if you take away the faith in some of those books, there is no story. So, that is one example. So for me, it is dependent on the book. It is dependent on the author. I can label it clean and I can tell you I enjoyed it. Does that mean you're going to label it clean and you're going to enjoy it? No. But every reader is different, and it is very hard to recommend a book for somebody else because you don't know their situation. So, okay. So my next bullet point in the great content debate is explicit scenes for their own sake. This I do not understand. Are you trying to write adult film books and sell them as a romance? We have another word for that. And if that's what you're trying to do, then I actually think they need to be sold in an adult film or an adult store in which you have to be 18 to enter. Why? Back in the day, you used to call what today would probably be classified as mildly spicy a bodice ripper book. And you knew what you were getting when you purchased it. It was a bodice ripper. You knew there was going to be content. How much content? You didn't know, but you knew there was a visual clue on that cover. It could have the most innocuous title in the universe, like, My Highland Wedding, and have an absolute bodice ripper of a cover, and you knew there was going to be some content, and you could make your choice. Today, we have innocuous covers, innocuous titles that are not reflective of the content in the book. Every once in a while, you'll get a innocuous, cover and a title that hints at what's going on. But for the most part, explicit scenes in books are not belied by their cover or title these days. And social media in particular has led to an absolute explosion of explicit scene writing, and those books becoming far more popular than they would have been, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. Do I think it's healthy? No. Do I think that parents letting their teenagers pick books off of TikTok or, any of the other social media platforms that promote books heavily without reading them first is wise? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Do I think the content has become more explicit? I absolutely do. And, we have a video game rating system, which, says teen or mature. Why doesn't that system exist for books? Why isn't there some objective qualification? And I can tell you the answer, because none of us want our books going through a censor and, holding up the process, having to refine for censor taste, and yet we submit video games through the exact same process. Admittedly, there are less video games published in a yearly basis than there are books, but in general, you consume a book far faster than you do a video game. So it's a very difficult and thorny question, and we need to acknowledge that there is a double standard between how we treat video game content and how we treat books. And, we will label something as mature in a video game, and that same content will be marketed for a preteen in a book. It's objectionable, it is vile, and yet we don't think twice about it. We really, really don't. Which is very sad. So, next bullet point, I sort of already talked about this. Take out content you find objectionable. Does the book still stand up? I did talk about this briefly. And this truly, defines what is and is not a book I'm going to continue reading. So, let's just take The Fourth Wing, for example. The opening page of the book has the F word in it. It is not a word I use in everyday language. It is not a word I, read. It is usually a pretty good example of, I'm going to DNF this book really quick. However, in Fourth Wing, the use of that word in particular was situationally appropriate for our main character. And in her shoes and in that world, I would have said the exact same thing. That's one example. Later on in Fourth Wing, and there's intermittent swearing throughout Fourth Wing, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And then much later in Fourth Wing, there are a couple of open door scenes. They are by no means the most objectionable ones I've ever come across, but they are there, and this book is marketed to young adults. And I didn't read the scenes. I didn't need to. If you remove those scenes, would the story have suffered? And in the example of Fourth Wing, absolutely, yes. Yes, it absolutely would have suffered. So there's two examples of content that if you removed would have changed the book. So an example of content in a book that if you removed it, would it have suffered, is Bookshop Cinderella by Laura Lee Gerke. Trust the picture. This is a great romance. It is a historical Regency set, I believe. Read it a couple months ago. And 95% of that book is absolutely unobjectionable in my opinion. And then towards the end, as they are realizing they're in love, there is an open door scene. It's by far not the most explicit thing ever written. But did it need to be there based on the other content in the book and how the book concludes? No. Could you have removed that scene and would the book have stood on its own 2 feet? Absolutely, 100%. Yes. That scene was in there to sell books. Now, it isn't a bodice ripper cover. There's no indication that that scene is going to be there. If you look back at some of her back catalog, there are bodice ripper covers. I didn't do it before I read it. But did it ruin the whole book experience for me? No. No, it did not. Did it need to be there? No, it absolutely did not. So, why? Why? You had a great story going. You had romance, you had, developing, blossoming love. It was fantastic. And then you threw that in there to sell books. And that didn't need to be there. And that scene was nowhere near as spicy as, let's say, what's in Fourth Wing. And yet, there's a different reaction to the book. Will I read the next one in that series? I will. I'll know what to expect. But the story alone was worth it for me. So, it's a sliding scale. For many of you, both of those books would be an automatic no for various reasons, and that's fine. That's what makes it so hard to recommend books to people and to understand what someone else is going to possibly feel about a book. We're all different. We all come from, different life circumstances and histories, and even, it is difficult to recommend books to your best friends who, their reading taste, because you don't know how they're going to react to content. So it is a difficult journey. So next up, let's talk about swearing in books. In general, I rarely swear. I'll tell you a story. I went to kindergarten. It was public school kindergarten. Catholic kindergarten didn't exist in my slice of the world at the time. So I went to public school kindergarten. Second day of school, I was allowed to ride the bus with all my friends in the neighborhood. Rode the bus, went to school, came home. Mom met me at the bus. We walked in the house, and my 5-year-old mouth promptly told her the F word. That went over like a lead balloon. I never rode the bus again, and I never said that word again until I was in college. And I was a freshman, and my parents had come to pick me up for the weekend, and we were loading my dirty clothes in the trunk of the car, and I dropped something on my foot, and the F word came flying out of my mouth. And to say my parents were Stunned, disappointed, and more than mildly upset with me would be an understatement. And once again, the word disappeared from my vocabulary. So it isn't, I don't swear a lot personally. It drives me nuts. Do I judge others that swear? No, because, well, to be honest, my husband swears like a sailor from the Seventh Fleet, and we have been married 20 years later this year. And while his mouth is not quite the potty mouth it once was, he still swears far more than I'm comfortable with. Does it mean I don't love the man? No. No, he just grew up in a different environment. So when it comes to swearing in books, I honestly think my brain has learned over the decades to ignore those words. I skip them. I don't notice them. They're not, they have to be really blatant, and they have to be like on the first page of a book, like in Fourth Wing. But they're not something that causes me to, unless it's like every other word in a sentence, or there's a swear word on every page. If it's occasional, if it's situationally appropriate and it's something I would say in the same situation, I don't notice it. I honestly don't. So I can't tell you that every book I love is swear free. If it bothers you, you're probably gonna have to double check language with someone else, or a Goodreads or Storygraph or something, because I won't know. I honestly don't read it. Like, I just recently recommended the newest Mary Kay Andrews book, and one of my friends read it, and she DNF'd it because of the swearing. And I'm like, what swearing? I honestly didn't catch it. And I consider Mary Kay Andrews a clean read. So, in most cases, do I think there needs to be swearing in books? No. I think it's a lazy use of the English language. I think if an author has to resort to swearing that much, then, you're just being lazy. I'll give you a great example of a book in which it was situationally appropriate. That was The Women by Christian Hanna. Set in Vietnam War. She's a war veteran when she comes home. Is there swearing in that book? Absolutely, yes, there is. Are there situational experiences in that book that would a lot of people find objectionable? Absolutely, there is. Would the book work without either one of those things? Nope. Nope, it would not. So to say that you can't read swearing in a book, and it's automatically objectionable, I don't understand. Is it my favorite language choice? No. Do I think it's lazy on the part of an author? For the most part, given the prevalence of it today, absolutely. Do I think it is sometimes appropriate for the story and for the situation? Absolutely. So it isn't content that automatically disqualifies a book for me personally. My brain doesn't read it for the most part, and I understand that not everyone feels the same way about swearing. There's a swearing difference in my own household. It would be disingenuous and dishonest of me to disqualify a book for its language when people in my own house swear. And that's just how I feel about that one. All right, next bullet point. Why I don't give trigger warnings. Well, because I think there were I'm trying to word this without being offensive. I think they're nonsense. Done a deep dive on this, which I will link in the description down below. Human beings process their emotions and experiences through storytelling, be it oral storytelling, written storytelling, musical storytelling, poems, sagas. Human beings experience and handle their trauma and life experience through the act of storytelling. And the only way you learn to deal with the past and things that bother you and emotional difficulties is by dealing with it. If you can't deal with the stuff that bothers you, it is just going to fester and become more of an issue as time goes on. And I can give you a personal example. In our marriage, we suffered multiple miscarriages. And it was and is to this day the single most traumatic thing in my life personally. No one in my family had suffered one. I never talked about them because it's a subject that makes people uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. But it is not a reason that I am going to not pick up a book. Even if the first time I pick it up and, miscarriages have happened or are happening in the story, I may set it aside and come back to it later. And I have an example for that, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it isn't a reason I'm not going to read something. Life is difficult and it doesn't get easier as you get older. And if you don't expose yourself to what others have gone through that you have gone through, that hurt festers and it doesn't improve and it grows out of proportion to the actual harm suffered. I'm not minimizing the harm, but not reading a book because it has domestic violence or it has a character that talks about a sexual assault or it talks about miscarriage means that it means your emotional growth is always going to be stunted because you can't move past the hurt. And if you can't move past the hurt, you can't forgive yourself. You can't forgive the perpetrator, and you can't deal effectively with other things because you have this great big giant ball of hurt that never is not contracting. It's just slowly expanding. I have an example. So I picked up last year the newest J. Ryan Stalled book. I love his writing. I've read everything he's written, and so I picked up the Lakeside Supper Club. There's a picture right here, and so last bullet point I wrote down was, what's the good old days? When I was a kid, I read a lot. And by a lot, I mean a lot. I have been reading since I was 2, and I have never stopped. And until I turned 18, and I was, considered, I was in college, I was allowed to make my own decisions. If I read it, either my parents had read it first, or someone they trusted in their inner circle, be it a librarian, a family friend, a teacher, had also read the book and knew what the content was. So I wasn't given access to, let's say, bodice rippers until I was 18. If it was, a bodice ripper and considered mild enough, then yeah, okay. I could read it. But, my parents were very aware of everything I read. Be it a mystery, a romance, or historical fiction, science fiction, it didn't matter. Someone immediately close to my family had read that book. And I was given free rein to wander the library. I could read anything I wanted. If someone hadn't read it, then my parents would, read it and, at least skim it if they didn't read the whole thing, to make sure that it was, that it wasn't the worst bodice ripper known to mankind. And I didn't particularly enjoy romance, so that wasn't, something they were overly concerned with. I was given free rein in the library. I had proven myself to, be intelligent about what I like to read. I wasn't interested in the salacious, so it wasn't a problem. Today, parents seem, and this is just my perception, to have abdicated monitoring what their children read and let them read whatever is popular and don't involve themselves in that decision. And I do not understand. If your child is reading a book, and I don't care if they are 5 or 17 years old, they are still your responsibility. And if you don't care what they're reading, then you cannot argue that you are doing a good job as a parent. You can you can try to argue that, well, we both work jobs and life is too busy and I don't have time. Guess what? Parents have always been busy, and parents have always had to make time to understand what their child is consuming. So that is not a valid excuse. Handing your child a phone and letting them, go on TikTok and Instagram and, whatever else social media wise, without it being closely monitored, exposes them to books and content that is inappropriate. We've all seen books that have been marketed to preteens and early teens that are wholly inappropriate. Just wholly inappropriate. And yet, parents don't think twice. In the old days, that would just not have flown. And my parents weren't exceptional. All of my friends' parents monitored what they read too. And, our librarians weren't purchasing young adult books that had sexual content in them or that were exceptionally violent for, let's say, a 13-year-old. But it didn't happen. Writers weren't writing it, and if they were writing it, they weren't making it into the public library. And they certainly weren't making it into our school library. And yet, that has changed. And we have somehow, as a society, normalized all of those things and simultaneously excused ourselves from knowing what our kids are reading. Is it any wonder that they are a very confused generations who can't handle emotional issues and who can't deal with their stuff? They haven't had to. They're not challenged. They read what's popular, and what's popular is, what sells books. What sells books? Same thing that leads on the news. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's sex, it sells. Now, am I saying that I didn't read challenging books and that I think young adults can't read challenging books? No, I read challenging books. I, always read well above my grade level. I always read, adult books. I was a voracious reader. And sometimes those, I would occasionally pick a book that was too challenging for me, either in content or in word choices or in subject matter. And I would go talk about it with my parents, and they would sometimes, occasionally, say, you know what? Why don't we set that book aside for a year or two, and if you're still interested, you can come back to it. Or you can come back to that when you're 18 and making decisions on your own. Why have we lost that? Why have we decided that suddenly kids today don't need it? I have my answer. It's the rise of cell phones. It's the rise of the internet. We have changed as a society, and it is not in my opinion, a change for the better. Yes, we now have friends across the globe, but at what cost? At what cost have we decided that it is worth sacrificing our children to have a global reach? And only parents can decide that, you know what, this is not working for my kids, it is not working for our family, and we are going to take away cell phones, and we are going to limit internet time, and we're going to make kids go outside and play away from television screens and away from, video games and cell phone content. Go outside and play, use your imagination, learn to use your brain in an environment that isn't structured. That is a decision every parent has to make, and a choice every adult has to make. And I think it gets harder as time progresses because there's no institutional memory of making decisions on your own. There's no institutional memory of walking into the library and just picking up books because the cover looks interesting, or you read the inside flap and it sounds like something you'd enjoy. So you pick it up and you take it home. Now, not me, but now people walk in the library, cell phone out, they're checking Goodreads, they're asking their friends, have you read this? Should I read it? They're not making decisions on their own. They're relying on perfect strangers to tell them whether or not a book is good. Based on what? Based on what criteria does that make sense? Sure. Person A on Goodreads loved the book. You have no idea what their life experience is, but they loved the book. Person B thought it was okay. And again, you don't know their life experience. And person C thought it was trash. Okay. So you have the spectrum. And so which one do you believe is an accurate reflection of your reading preferences? Because you have no knowledge of them as people. They're just random people across the globe who left a review on a book on Goodreads. I don't know how that makes sense. Yes, that makes me an old fuddy-duddy. No, I never walk into the library and use Goodreads to make a decision about a book. I just don't. My brain is more than capable of deciding that on its own. And I have run across wonderful books based on that. And I have, been disappointed. And I have been everything in between. But it's that ability to decide for myself that keeps my brain intellectually curious and intellectually hungry and willing to take a chance on an unknown author, an unknown book, a new genre, because it sounds interesting or the cover looks great. That's how people, since the invention of the printing press, have decided what they're going to read. Does it sound good? Has someone in your circle read it? Did they enjoy it? Okay. There is no greater motivator to read a book than intellectual curiosity. The ability to open yourself up to, possibly deal with stuff in your past or stuff that, is upsetting, or to discover a new love and a new writer, and to realize that, hey, I never thought I liked this genre, but I read this book in it and it really worked for me. So I'm going to go search something else out in said genre and see if I like that too. A world without intellectual curiosity is a world open to being led around by the nose, because if you can't think for yourself, then you can't question anything in your life. And if you can't question anything in your life, I am very sad for you. I think there is nothing greater than walking into your library and wandering the shelves and picking out a book that grabs your attention. You may love it, you may hate it, it may be filled with content that is objectionable or is so stunning you're moved to tears. How are you going to know unless you actually try it yourself? I can give you an example. So in 2022, I was in the library, and on the new shelf there was the Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. This book has a beautiful cover, and I knew there was a little bit of buzz about it, but I didn't know anything about it. So I opened the flap and I read it was about Chinese mythology, and it was a, retelling. I don't know anything about Chinese mythology. It wasn't, I don't generally like retellings, but the cover was intriguing. The flap sounded interesting. I took a chance. That duology is amazing. And I never would have even remotely come across it and read it if I hadn't been intellectually curious because of the cover of the book and what the flap said. And that's thanks to my library. That's thanks to me not, flipping open my phone or flipping open my phone. I don't have a flip phone anymore. But, opening my phone and checking on Goodreads. I don't know what its rating is on Goodreads. I don't use Goodreads. I use Goodreads for giveaways, and that's about it because it's toxic. And I would rather trust my own senses and my own brain power to figure out what my brain likes versus what somebody else's brain likes. So, intellectual curiosity drives my reading to this day. Be it in what I purchase, what I check out from the library, what I stumble across on Kindle Unlimited. It's intellectual curiosity. And being open to stuff that is potentially painful. Because I know in the long run, I need to read said stuff. So, okay. Next up. So I do have, at this point, I think it's 10 authors. I know I'm going to highlight as this series continues this year and next. It's probably going to be like every 6 weeks. I'm going to jump in and talk about an author. And I think the first one I'm going to talk about is Mary Kay Andrews. She writes a beach read every year and a Christmas story every year. She has a mystery series. She has what I'm going to call girlfriend drama books. She has this year's beach read, for example, had a mystery and romance and family drama all wrapped up into one. So she is a very easy recommendation author for me. Yes, as I found out, there's swearing in her books, but you know what? It doesn't bother me. I didn't even notice there was swearing in the most recent book. I love her as an author. Another author I have no problem recommending, is a very easy recommendation for me, is Anne Perry. Anne Perry she died this year or late last year, a prolific mystery writer. She has 2 books set in the late Victorian, 2 book series set in the late Victorian era. She has a third, I think, which is set at the beginning of the Edwardian era. She has one set at the outset of World War II in Europe. She has a great, Christmas line of books that are either tangentially related to one of her series or are complete standalones, and those are great. And easy recommendation. And another easy recommendation for me from the list is a series by multiple authors, and that's the Halo series. The Halo series of books, and there are, I think, 40 plus books at this point, as a result of the video game. And they're science fiction, they're written by multiple authors, they cover Halo lore before, during, outside of the video game, and they are fantastic. And there's probably some swearing in there again. I don't recall there being swearing, but they're just great science fiction reads. And you don't have to have played the video game to enjoy those books. I have no problem recommending Halo books. Another, I think this is the last one I'm going to share, another author I'm going to have easy recommendations for, and I have no trouble ever recommending, is Elizabeth Chadwick. She writes historical fiction. She writes these incredibly beautiful love stories. And her historical fiction is usually set earlier in, medieval history versus, let's say, Tudor England or Renaissance Italy. Hers are usually set in the 13th, 14th centuries, and I love them, and she's a very easy recommendation for me. So those are just a couple of previews of what is going to be coming in this series. I have many more authors. I span the genre. It isn't going to be all contemporary. It isn't going to be all science fiction. As you know, I read almost anything. I read across genres. I don't have a personal preference. My preference is for excellent writing and amazing storytelling. And if those 2 things succeed, then I can forgive, quote unquote, forgive objectionable content, because you're telling me a story that I want to hear. And that's all a good book is supposed to be. A story you want to hear. that is the great content debate for me. And I think the coming, recommendations are not going to be for everybody. They're not going to be authors everyone wants to read. And they're not going to be, in some cases, books that have ever been on radars or are obscure. And that's, I'm okay with that. I can't read for the algorithm. I can't read for the audience. I need to read for me. I need to be intellectually curious. I need to, continually expose myself to things and to grow as a reader and to constantly fall in love with books. Because that's how this all started. I fell in love with books. Not just romances and not just historical fiction, or mysteries. I fell in love with reading and exploring and, things in and outside my comfort zone. I don't want to be comfortable as a reader. I want to be challenged. I want my brain to see all the amazing things that God has allowed others to write. Am I going to love it all? No. Is some of it going to be uncomfortable and challenging? Yes. But that's what reading is. It's intellectual curiosity tempered by experience and faith. So, I hope you stay tuned for the first author recommendation and all the ones after. And I hope this gives you a little better idea of who I am as a reader, and it may or may not make you comfortable with my recommendations going forward, and that's okay. I'm not going to, take offense. I am who I am, and at this point in my life, I am very comfortable in my own skin, and the chances of me changing dramatically are slim. And I'm wise enough to know that about myself. So, that has been my TED Talk. I look forward to your comments down below. Like and subscribe. And I will see you here next time at the Protagonist Pub.